In the final, desperate years of the Second World War, when the skies over Europe had become a relentless battlefield of smoke, contrails, and falling wreckage, one name inspired both admiration and fear across the Eastern Front: Erich Hartmann. To his fellow Luftwaffe pilots, he was the Black Devil. To Soviet airmen, he was a phantom who struck without warning. By 1944, Hartmann had already become the highest-scoring fighter ace in history, flying the agile Messerschmitt Bf 109 and claiming hundreds of aerial victories against Soviet aircraft. Success had shaped his confidence, experience had sharpened his instincts, and yet, as the war shifted westward and American air power flooded the European skies, Hartmann would face a new kind of enemy, one he initially underestimated. By mid-1944, the Western Allies had achieved overwhelming industrial momentum. Waves of American bombers crossed into occupied Europe daily, escorted by long-range fighters designed not merely to defend, but to dominate. Among them was the sleek and deadly P-51 Mustang, an aircraft that combined speed, altitude performance, and endurance in a way that changed the very geometry of air combat. But from the perspective of a veteran Eastern Front ace like Hartmann, American pilots seemed inexperienced compared to the hardened Soviet flyers he had fought for years. He had survived hundreds of engagements by relying on patience, surprise, and disciplined attack runs. He believed these new opponents would be no different. On a cold morning in late 1944, Hartmann and his squadron were scrambled to intercept Allied formations pushing deeper into German-controlled territory. The Luftwaffe was stretched thin. Fuel shortages crippled training programs. Replacement pilots often lacked combat experience. Yet Hartmann remained a symbol of defiance, a reminder that skill could still challenge numbers. As his Bf 109 roared down the runway and lifted into the gray sky, he climbed toward the thin air where contrails marked the passage of bombers and their escorts. From a distance, the American formation appeared orderly, almost mechanical. Silver bombers flying in tight defensive boxes, fighters weaving above and beside them. Hartmann studied the pattern carefully. He had built his record on a simple principle: close in unseen, fire at point-blank range, and break away before the enemy could react. He avoided prolonged dogfights. Precision, not aggression, was his weapon. As he positioned himself for an attack, he assumed the American escorts would react slowly, perhaps clumsily. Many Luftwaffe veterans believed American pilots relied too heavily on formation discipline and less on individual aerial skill. Hartmann dove. The Bf 109 sliced downward, engine screaming as he lined up a bomber in his gun sight. The distance closed rapidly. At less than 100 meters, he fired a short, devastating burst. Cannon shells struck the bomber's wing root. Smoke erupted instantly. The American aircraft fell out of formation, trailing fire. Hartmann pulled up sharply, expecting the usual confusion. On the Eastern Front, Soviet escorts often reacted a few seconds too late. Those seconds had always been enough. But this time, the sky did not behave as expected. Within moments, sleek shapes detached from the escort formation with startling coordination. P-51 Mustangs rolled into aggressive pursuit, their Merlin engines howling as they accelerated. These were not hesitant defenders, they were hunters. One Mustang slashed across Hartmann's flight path, forcing him into a sharp, evasive turn. Another climbed above him, cutting off his escape route. The discipline he had mistaken for rigidity transformed into fluid, lethal teamwork. Hartmann felt something unfamiliar: surprise. The American fighters did not chase recklessly. They anticipated. They boxed him in. He rolled inverted and dove again, using gravity to gain speed. Tracers flashed past his canopy. The Mustang pilots maintained pressure, using altitude advantage and superior high-speed performance. The Bf 109 was agile, but it demanded careful energy management. A single mistake could cost everything. For the first time in that engagement, Hartmann realized he was no longer dictating the fight. The sky had changed in minutes. American escort doctrine had evolved dramatically. Early in the war, bombers had often flown with limited protection. Losses had been severe. But by late 1944, long-range escorts could accompany bombers all the way to their targets and back. Mustang pilots were trained not just to defend, but to sweep ahead, clear the air, and aggressively pursue Luftwaffe interceptors. They hunted in pairs, covering each other's blind spots. They used radio communication with efficiency that the increasingly strained Luftwaffe struggled to match. Hartmann poled into a climbing spiral, forcing one Mustang to overshoot. He snapped into a tight turn and fired, but the American pilot broke away cleanly. No panic, no hesitation. Another Mustang dropped in from above, bullets striking near Hartmann's wingtip. The message was unmistakable. This was not the Eastern Front. As he fought to disengage, Hartmann's calculations shifted from attack to survival. He descended toward cloud cover, using layers of gray to mask his retreat. The Mustangs followed briefly, then broke off, returning to their primary mission. Their discipline again surprised him. They were not chasing glory, they were protecting the bombers and maintaining air superiority. Back at base, Hartmann reviewed the encounter with a rare seriousness. He had destroyed a bomber, but nearly lost his aircraft in the process. The Americans were different. Their aircraft performance at altitude, their coordination, and their refusal to be baited into reckless dogfights signaled a transformation in the air war over Europe. The industrial might of the United States was now fully present in the skies. Factories thousands of miles away were producing fighters and bombers in staggering numbers. Replacement pilots arrived with standardized training. Radio networks linked formations with precision. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, was fighting with diminishing resources. Veteran aces like Hartmann carried immense experience, but experience alone could not compensate for shrinking fuel supplies and inexperienced wingmen. Yet Hartmann remained confident. Instead, he adapted. He studied Mustang tactics. He reminded his squadron to avoid direct engagement with escort fighters whenever possible. Strike fast, strike unexpectedly, never linger. The sky had become more dangerous, but it was still a battlefield governed by skill. In subsequent missions, Hartmann approached American formations with greater caution. He observed how Mustangs maintained altitude superiority. He noted their acceleration in dives. He understood that prolonged turning fights favored neither side if energy was lost. His strategy returned to its purest form: surprise attack and immediate disengagement. But something fundamental had shifted. The psychological edge the Luftwaffe once enjoyed was fading. Allied pilots no longer seemed intimidated by German aces. They hunted them deliberately. Each encounter became less about individual legend and more about coordinated systems, training, production, logistics, communication. In the vast theater of World War II, air superiority was no longer decided by a handful of extraordinary men. It was decided by industry, doctrine, and relentless pressure. For Hartmann, the realization was stark. He could still win individual duels, he could still outmaneuver opponents in fleeting moments of brilliance, but the sky itself was no longer Germany's domain. American fighters filled it in growing numbers. Bombers returned day after day, despite losses. The rhythm of war had shifted irreversibly. On that cold mission when he underestimated American fighters, Hartmann glimpsed the future. It was not defined by a single aces tally of victories. It was defined by waves, waves of silver aircraft, waves of coordinated escorts, waves of industrial power that no single pilot could exhaust. The sky had changed in minutes, and from that day forward, every Luftwaffe sortie carried the weight of that truth.
By early 1945, the air war over Europe had reached a brutal crescendo. The Luftwaffe, once dominant over the continent, now fought a defensive battle against overwhelming Allied numbers. For Erich Hartmann, the transformation of the skies was no longer a sudden shock, it was a daily reality. The American presence had expanded beyond occasional escort missions. Now the horizon itself seemed permanently streaked with Allied contrails. Long-range fighters roamed deep into German airspace, hunting not just bombers' threats, but any aircraft that dared to rise. Hartmann's squadron felt the pressure in every scramble order. Fuel was rationed, training flights were limited, replacement pilots arrived with fewer hours in the cockpit than ever before. Many had never experienced true combat before being thrown into it. Hartmann understood that his greatest advantage, discipline, had to be drilled into them quickly. He reminded them constantly, never engage blindly, never linger, never assume the enemy is inferior. The American fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, had proven that assumption deadly. In one of his later engagements against American formations, Hartmann approached from extreme altitude, using the sun as concealment. It was a tactic as old as aerial warfare itself: attack out of the glare, disappear before retaliation. Below him, a stream of bombers moved steadily eastward. The formation looked almost serene from a distance, sunlight reflecting off polished aluminum fuselages. But Hartmann knew the calm was deceptive. Above and around those bombers circled Mustangs, alert and patient. He selected a straggler on the edge of the formation. Timing was everything. Too early, and the escorts would spot him. Too late, and defensive fire would shred his aircraft. He dove sharply, engine howling as speed built rapidly. For a brief second, the world narrowed to the gun sight and the massive wing filling his view. He fired at close range, watching strikes ripple across metal skin. Then came the response. Two Mustangs broke formation almost instantly, rolling toward him with disciplined precision. They did not dive recklessly. One stayed slightly higher, maintaining energy. The other approached from a lateral angle, forcing Hartmann into a defensive maneuver. He felt the pressure tighten like a noose. These pilots were not intimidated by his reputation. They were trained to work together, to deny him space. Hartmann pulled into a high-speed dive, pushing his Messerschmitt Bf 109 to its limits. The airframe shuddered slightly as velocity increased. He knew the Bf 109 could accelerate quickly in a dive, but at high speed the controls stiffened. The Mustang behind him maintained remarkable stability. The distance did not widen as easily as it once might against earlier Allied fighters. Tracer fire flashed close enough to rattle him. He snapped into a sudden climbing turn, bleeding speed deliberately to force an overshoot. One Mustang shot past, unable to adjust in time. Hartmann fired instinctively, but missed. The second Mustang anticipated the maneuver and stayed above, refusing to be drawn in. That discipline again, that refusal to chase glory. It was methodical, almost clinical. The engagement lasted only minutes, but to Hartmann it felt like a compressed lesson in the new air war. He eventually disengaged by diving into lower cloud cover, escaping through layers of gray turbulence. When he landed, he said little. The numbers in his logbook still grew. His record continued to expand, yet he understood that every victory required more caution than before. The broader war situation offered no illusions. Allied bombers were crippling German industry. Oil refineries burned. Rail networks were shattered. The Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies was eroding not because of lack of courage, but because of dwindling resources. Even the greatest ace could not fight without fuel. Hartmann's approach evolved further. He became even more selective, attacking only when absolute surprise was achievable. He avoided extended engagements with escort fighters whenever possible. Younger pilots sometimes felt frustration. They wanted dramatic dogfights. Hartmann insisted on restraint. See, decide, attack, breakaway. It was a formula that had served him against Soviet aircraft and now was essential against American escorts. Yet the American airmen adapted as well. Escort fighters began flying aggressive sweeps ahead of bomber formations, actively seeking Luftwaffe interceptors before they could even approach. Radar coverage improved. Coordination between ground control and fighter groups tightened. The skies over Germany became a layered defense system, with Mustangs acting not merely as guardians, but as predators. One afternoon, Hartmann's unit encountered a formation of Mustangs operating independently of bombers, a fighter sweep deep over German territory. The encounter was sudden and violent. Without bombers to protect, the Mustang pilots were free to maneuver offensively. They climbed aggressively, attempting to gain altitude superiority. Hartmann immediately ordered his wingmen to disengage and regroup rather than accept disadvantage. The dogfight that followed was chaotic, spirals of aircraft climbing and diving in tight arcs. The sky seemed crowded, every direction filled with motion. Hartmann managed to isolate one Mustang that strayed slightly from its partner. He executed his trademark close-range approach and fired. The American aircraft rolled inverted and descended sharply, smoke trailing. But there was no time to celebrate. Another Mustang flashed past his canopy so closely that he glimpsed the pilot's helmet through the glass. Bullets tore through the air around him. Hartmann felt a jolt of clarity. The margin for error had nearly vanished. He rolled hard, forcing separation, and dove away at maximum speed. Behind him, the Mustangs regrouped instead of pursuing recklessly. Again, the discipline. By spring 1945, the outcome of the war in Europe was no longer in doubt. Allied ground forces advanced from west and east. Cities lay in ruins. The Luftwaffe fought on, but it was a shadow of its former strength. Hartmann continued flying missions, driven by duty rather than illusion. Each sortie felt heavier than the last. He would ultimately finish the war as the highest-scoring fighter ace in history, credited with 352 aerial victories, most on the Eastern Front. Yet his encounters with American fighters left a lasting impression. He had witnessed firsthand the shift from individual dominance to industrial supremacy. The United States had not relied solely on heroic pilots. It had built systems, training pipelines, aircraft production lines, coordinated tactics that multiplied effectiveness. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the sky over Europe finally fell silent. For Hartmann, the war's end marked not triumph, but captivity. He would spend years as a prisoner before eventually returning home. The legends surrounding his record would endure, debated and studied by historians and aviation experts alike. But beyond the numbers lies a deeper story. When Hartmann underestimated American fighters, he encountered more than skilled opponents. He confronted the transformation of modern air warfare. The age when a single ace could shape entire campaigns was fading. In its place rose coordinated air power on a scale never before seen. The sky had changed, not just in minutes, but permanently. And in that vast, cold expanse over war-torn Europe, two realities collided: the brilliance of individual mastery and the unstoppable force of industrial war.